My name is Rebecca Snyder. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association, and I welcome you all here today to join with Bryan Sears, the government reporter, state government reporter for the Daily Record and public records aficionado and an expert, to talk to us about getting and using public records in reporting. So a couple housekeeping notes. I am recording this session. We've recorded every session in the Into the Newsroom series, and I'll send it out in the Friday Planner so you can review tips and tricks. I would also direct you to our YouTube channel for a fabulous, the previous sessions that we have already recorded are digital photography on the go, which we had with Graham Cullen 2 weeks ago, and then interviewing and building rapport remotely with Tom Linthicum, which was earlier in the series, and then our inaugural time, which was getting to know your beat with Chris Harvey at the University of Maryland. Coming up August 12th, we will have our last session in the series about media ethics with Jody Beck, and that will also be 9:30 to 10:15. If you have questions during the session, I'll be monitoring the chat box, but feel free to ask your questions, and I'll break in so that Bryan can answer your questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bryan, and he's going to share some of his tips and tricks.
So a little bit about me real quick. I am sort of a self-taught public records person by the very nature of how I came up in the business. I got my first job when I was just before the age of 19, working for a small community weekly on the east side of Baltimore County. And I have basically come up through a lot of the smaller local papers all of my career here in Maryland. And so very early on, I learned very quickly that if I wanted to get copies of records, if I wanted to get access to public documents, I was going to have to learn the law myself. The paper that I first started working for did not have a lawyer, and my editor didn't have a lot of expertise in the Public Information Act, so it was very much self-taught. And it's not hard to learn, and it's something that everybody can do. I was joking with Rebecca before we started, and I say this sort of jokingly, but also to make a point. In a lot of cases, for me, the best public records requests that I file are the ones that I don't file. My experience has been that once you file an official written request for something, you get the lawyers involved. Their law and they're going to take their time depending on what agency you deal with. Agencies will deal with you at differing rates. We used to joke in Baltimore County when I worked for a group of community weeklies that the Baltimore County public school system, you could basically time your request on the calendar, and you knew on day 29 that was when you were going to get an answer, and they wouldn't communicate with you about it for 29 straight days. Other agencies are really, really pretty good. My thought always is to start by just simply asking. And some of this really, for me, goes back to sort of the simple basic things that you learn as a reporter. I mean, and again, this is, I'm looking at Tim Wheeler over here, who's probably forgotten more about going after stuff than I have learned yet. And for me, it all comes down to relationships and knowing your beat and knowing the people on your beat. Because sometimes the best request is just simply being able to go to somebody and ask for a document. It's a little, depending on what you want, it's a little harder to get. If you're looking for emails, for example, you're never going to get those by simply walking into an office and asking for emails. If you are somebody at a local paper covering local development and zoning, or covering environmental issues, sometimes those public records are already available for inspection, and you can walk in and look at them just by knowing where they're kept and who keeps them, and having a little bit of a relationship. I also try to think outside the box about who might have already seen these records that has them. covering the State House, covering the Baltimore County Council. There are a lot of documents that float around that are in the hands of legislative aides and lawmakers and lobbyists and advocates for various things that are public documents that, sometimes it's just as when you're having a conversation and they mention something, just simply saying, how do you know that? Do you have a document? And getting a copy of that ends up being a great start. That to me, I can't sort of stress enough the building of personal relationships just to start the public records, the access to public records. I always tell young reporters that I work with that the other thing that they want to do is to learn, if you're covering a specific beat, if you're lucky enough to cover a certain area, or if you're coming in and you're covering development or cops and courts, learn the kinds of records that they collect. And I always made a point of going, and somebody once told me, and I now tell other people, that one of the best things you can do and one of the easiest requests you can make is to go in and ask for blank copies of forms. If you're covering zoning, there are a lot of things that get filled out in the development world, and getting copies of the forms with nothing on them is a really easy request. There's very little to redact, and typically speaking, you don't need to get a lawyer involved, and it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that an agency is requesting, because knowing specifically the kind of documents you're looking for makes all the difference in the world. I also make a point of when I'm looking for a record, and I'm speaking to someone in an agency, asking them, saying, "Hey, look, I'm looking for this kind of information. What kind of information do you collect? How do you collect it? What's the name of that? What's the name of that form?" A lot of times these forms have names. They have numbers. Knowing specifically those form names and form numbers can give you a real insight into what they're looking at. And again, going back and getting a blank copy of that form, and then you know exactly whether or not that's the document that you're looking for. That then you can file a larger request that's a little more specific. Depending on, I think probably a lot of people will be very surprised, especially at lower levels of government, but even in state government, there is not a lot of sophisticated record keeping. State and local government, municipal government is woefully behind in terms of keeping up with its technology. Things like emails are really easy to get. They are obviously electronic documents. Not everything is an electronic document. I make a typical request, and I will ask for electronic versions if they're available, because those are typically easier to get, and I find that there is less likelihood that they're going to jam me up on things like ridiculous copying costs. That being said, a lot of smaller governments have not spent a lot of money on technology. Even Baltimore City, you look at what happened in Baltimore City 12, 18 months ago with their computer systems getting locked down by ransomware. These are not the most sophisticated systems in the world, and sometimes paper documents are what you're going to be looking for. The other thing that I try to remind people to do is to narrowly target your request. The bigger the request, the more expansive you make the request, the longer it's going to take, and the more likely that they're going to try and jam you up with some ridiculous costs. I mean, anybody on this call who has had experience with filing a request, especially a large request for, say, emails, can probably tell you horror stories about responses that they got or a colleague got where they were asked for thousands of dollars or even tens of thousands of dollars, excuse me, to shake loose emails. So again, that's where, for me, that's where sort of knowing how an agency works, knowing who's involved in making particular decisions, or who might be involved in conversations about a particular subject matter, really comes into play. so that you can specifically go in and ask for, these 3 people, and their emails back and forth, asking for keywords. If you can narrow it down by a number of keywords, if you suspect that the emails that you're interested in, the conversations that you're interested in, are going to include a number of specific words or phrases, those tend to be helpful in whittling it down. I have found even local government's pretty good. Their IT people are pretty good at doing keyword searches on emails. So all of that is sort of, gets you to sort of the start of filing a request. I will tell people that the another great starting point, a parallel starting point, aside from learning the agencies, and learning who works there, is understanding the law. The law, Maryland's Public Information Act, is not a really difficult law to read. And so the first thing I tell people all the time is to go back and actually pull the section of the law. It's actually really easy to find. One of the other places that I recommend people go to is to go to the Attorney General's website. The Attorney General of Maryland, going back to Joe Curran, has done a really good job of posting essentially what I refer to as the government playbook on Public Information Act. The Attorney General has set up a manual that they give and they use during their trainings when they are training government agencies, whether it's municipal and local government agencies, or even their own staff internally, that explains the law. It's got a lot of footnotes in it, and it is a soup to nuts, beginning to end, on the Public Information Act, and it includes at the end, it includes a copy of the law. So I always tell people to go back and read the law, but then also go back through and read what the Attorney General is telling people is sort of best practice for handling requests. One of the things that is supposed to be a best practice in agencies is that agencies are supposed to compile a list of documents that they know right away are releasable, are public records that should be released immediately under law. I think probably in my 30-some years of covering state and local government, I have not found an agency yet that has that list. Even for simple things like getting copies of contracts for your local school superintendent or deputy superintendent can be very difficult, and they will ask for, even though they know it's black letter law that they have to release it, they will ask you for a written request, and they will generally hold that up for 10 to 30 days, depending. But they should have a list. The other thing that they should be doing is that within about 10 days of getting your request, they should be communicating with you, preferably by letter or by email. If you're I do a lot of my communication and a lot of my filing requests by email. They should be communicating with you about whether or not they have documents that are responsive to your request, and giving you a sense of how long it will take for them to get it to you. I generally am of the opinion that if you can get some records immediately and some records later, that's always a question you want to ask. There are a lot of times where you can talk to an agency and there are records that you are asking for that do not require a large level of review by lawyers, things that they can release pretty quickly, and other things that they know they're either going to have to pull, or that they are going to have to submit to the lawyers for some fairly in-depth legal review. If I can get things now, I will take them now, and with the idea that I know other stuff is coming. So don't hold on to this idea that you've got to wait for this large packet to come in the mail, or to go over to an office and pick up a gigantic box of documents. Take anything they're willing to give you, and I have done that. There have been some agencies in the past who have contacted me and said, we have some things ready for you now. We can give you some other things probably in 15 or 20 days. So take those if they offer them, and if they don't offer them, ask them if there are some things that you can have now. A lot of times there are. One of the going back to simply asking for the records, there are a lot of times where I will have conversations with custodians of the record, public spokespeople, asking about documents, and sometimes it's just enough to simply say, is that a public record? Is there any reason why I couldn't have it? I have found that, again, being nice, knowing the law, and asking for things will occasionally get you something. And it may not get you everything you want, but it will sometimes get you a jump start. The other thing that's important to understand is that agencies, despite the fact that we have this Public Information Act law, the state's Public Information Act law is not a great one. In fact, Maryland's law has been routinely rated as one of the weakest laws in the U.S. And there are, agencies and agency lawyers will do their best to try to find reasons to not release things to you. They will hide things. They will deny you under really broad denials, such as pre-decisional. You will not be able to see, for example, they will try to jam you up on emails saying that emails back and forth between a number of government officials is considered pre-decisional because they can't have these discussions and have these frank discussions about public business if they know that the public is actually going to be looking in on them and seeing what the hell they're saying. Some of these can be gotten around. Sometimes you can go to someone like the Public Information Act Ombudsman and work through some of this stuff. A lot of times you can't. Another one that they like to jam in there pretty regularly is investigatory. The police especially like to do this. I can tell you a number of years ago, I was covering a case in Baltimore County where a teenager shot his entire family, his parents and his two siblings, shot them to death, left the house and went back to a friend's house to play video games. And after the arrest, we had gotten some tips about some things that were likely to be brought up, and we filed a Public Information Act request for some documents in the police department wanting to see some things. And we were denied because it was considered investigatory. And at that point, I asked the spokesman at the time, who was actually a really reasonable guy to deal with, a man named Bill Toohey, and said, "Oh, so it's investigatory. You've already arrested this kid. He's sitting in jail. Does that suggest that there are other that there are other suspects? You're still looking for someone?" And they said, he very frankly said, "No." He said, "We got everybody. We think we got the person that did it. There's nobody else." They consider in Baltimore County and a number of other jurisdictions, they consider it a case in still the investigatory exemption still applies until the point where the suspect has been charged and the court case has been adjudicated. And in some cases, I've been denied because the court case, there are a number of appeals going on, and they will still argue that things are investigatory. And if it's not in the public record, if it's not in a court record, you can't have it. Court records are a great place to look for some public documents. If you're covering something where someone is suing the government or suing someone else, developers, for example, I love to go and sue over rulings. And they will litigants typically file lots and lots of Public Information Act requests as part of their lawsuits. In the past, it has been difficult to do that for litigants. The state has made it a little easier. Sometimes lawyers file those public records as exhibits in their lawsuits. And so sometimes it's just as simple as going to the courthouse and pulling the file and looking at the exhibits that have been filed. calling the lawyer that filed them and asking them what exhibits they have related to this. If they have emails, if they have public documents that show things, those are good calls to make. And again, if they're filed as part of the lawsuit, they're already public record, and you don't have to go through an agency to get them. I have learned I guess the hard way that it's also good to kind of have an idea of what kinds of requests an agency has already fulfilled. I know of one investigative reporter for a Baltimore television station who apparently routinely files Public Information Act requests on other reporters' Public Information Act requests, to get a sense of what is being asked for and what the agency has turned over. If you're looking for something and you suspect other reporters have already looked for it and gotten it, you can perhaps save yourself a little bit of time by knowing what the agency has already released, rather than letting them sort of lull you into the idea that you're the first and only person to have ever asked for this, and of course it's going to take 30 days for our lawyers to find this and look through it. One of the things that you want to do after you filed your request, I can't tell you how important this is. Actually, let me back up a second to getting to the point of when you actually go to file a request. If you've asked an agency for something and they tell you that you have to file a request, you generally have to do that in writing. There is no prescribed way of filing that request. The Attorney General's office has been really good about drawing up a sample of a request. And I very early on I made a copy of that and used that as a form letter. I have since moved away from that a little bit. State law doesn't require you to use the words Public Information Act. You don't have, I mean, it's nice if you send an email and say, if you send a letter and say, start with the words, this is a request under the Maryland Public Information Act, but it's not required. Any request for a document in writing is supposed to trigger the Public Information Act. I have joked with some agencies who have demanded that I file them in particular. They will try to prescribe a way that they want me to file it. And I will remind them of the law and say, I could file this in crayon written on toilet tissue if I wanted to. I have had agencies try to tell me that I couldn't file a request by email. That happens a lot less now. There are a lot of state agencies that are setting up as part of their website online forms or a generic email where you're simply sending an email to Department of Labor PIA, and you don't necessarily know who that person is. I will generally submit my Public Information Act requests on someone that I believe is the custodian of the record, if that is a particular public official, or file them directly with the public the public spokesperson for the agency who I'm dealing with. Really, for me, it's about knowing the names, knowing who to go to. I feel like sending these things into the ether at a generic box where you don't know who's actually reading them poses a little bit of a problem for me, because I want to be able to have a person I can go back to. If I have a question, if I want to know what's taking so long, I keep all of the emails and correspondence until the request is completed. And I did that as a just because I think journalists by nature are kind of pack rats and hoarders, and email, for example, makes that really easy to do. But I learned a lesson about why it was really important and why I was glad I had done it. When I had an issue with the Maryland Cannabis Commission and filed for some records and didn't hear back and didn't hear back and didn't hear back. And the spokesperson was kind of a pain to deal with. And I went back to her and I said, hey, look, you're 15 days into this, you haven't responded to this, where, like I'm supposed to get a letter. And she essentially tried to make the argument that that my request, that I hadn't made the request, and when I complained and went to her bosses, she she sent them an email of her account and essentially said that I had applied for the Public Information Act request stuff about 10 days after I had actually sent it in. So she jiggled the dates to she lied. I mean, I don't feel bad about pointing too fine a point on this. I put a very fine point on it with the executive director of the Cannabis Commission. She basically misrepresented and lied about what had happened. And I was able to supply all of the emails showing exactly when I had made the request and showing that she had emailed me an acceptance that she had received the letter, and then essentially had ignored all of my attempts afterwards to get an idea of how that request was moving through the system. I think at one point I was emailing her about every other day and was not getting any responses. What I ended up doing, because it became a problem, was I think at some point I had, if I'm being polite, I suggested that I was going to write a story about the fact that the agency had changed the dates on the request and was dragging their heels on documents. What that ended up resulting in was the executive director calling me after looking at the emails, and I think they actually went back and pulled the emails from their servers to compare with mine. I got a very apologetic executive director who called me and essentially asked me to not write that story and said, we have some documents we can give you today. Some of this other stuff, it's going to take us a little bit, but it's not going to take us 30 days. We're going to need about 7 days to get it to you. And that was still a couple of days over the 30-day deadline. But at that point, they were moving heaven and earth to get some things, and they understood they were in the wrong. And so I was willing to sort of to play ball at that point. Really, for me, writing the story was about shaking loose the document, and I've done it before a number of years ago, and this is still hanging around out there online. I wrote a number of blog posts for an online publication I worked for. I wrote daily updates in my attempts to get a copy of a deputy superintendent's contract. And I didn't even want the contract. What I really wanted, I called the Public Information Act spokesperson, and I called the public spokesperson and I asked her, can you tell me how much your deputy superintendent has been hired to, and what's her salary? What's her starting salary? And I was told I would have to file a Public Information Act request. The Public Information Act request only covers documents, and that's why I tell people to understand the law. It doesn't require the filing of a letter to get a question answered. If you just want to know, for example, how many police officers work in the White Marsh precinct? How much are you paying your deputy superintendent? And the spokesperson for the Baltimore County Public Schools, a delightful woman named Phyllis Reese, told me quite frankly that she was not going to tell me that I had to file a Public Information Act request. And I knew that that was going to take 30 days because that's how they did things. And I tried to explain it to her, and she dug her heels in. So the next day I called and I asked the same thing, and she sent me away. And so I think by day 2 I was starting to write about it. And this went on for roughly 36 days. Every morning I would get up, I would pick up the phone at 8:30, I would call Phyllis Reese in her office. I would say, hey, Phyllis, it's Brian. I was hoping you would tell me today how much the deputy superintendent is making. And she would tell me no. She came up with a litany of excuses about why I needed to file a request, including I suggested that since she had a good relationship with the superintendent, that she simply go next door and knock on the school superintendent's door and say, hey, Joe, remember that deputy superintendent you hired? How much did you tell her she'd make? And she told me that she'd actually have to create a document for that because she would have to write down the numbers. She couldn't trust herself to make sure that she got the numbers and the decimal points all in the right place. And she insisted on it. I think it all sort of culminated. We had a very a passionate discussion one morning where she couldn't understand why I was not going to file the request. And I tried to explain to her the law, and she insisted that I file it. And I said, Phyllis, it'll be a cold day in hell before I file that request. And she said, well, Bryan, it'll be a cold day in hell before I give it to you then. And I ended up writing a blog post called The Weather Forecast in Hell, which got a lot of attention from lawmakers in Annapolis who were following the Baltimore County school system and the hiring of this deputy superintendent. And I listed sort of the litany of excuses and all of the things that they were telling me about why they couldn't give it to me. I interviewed someone in the Attorney General's office who explained the law and explained why Baltimore County was out of bounds in what they were doing. But also sort of acknowledge that, you know, there's no guarantee, like the Public Information Act also doesn't mean that they'll answer my question. And ultimately, the resolution in this was lawmakers in Annapolis demanded that the school superintendent come to Annapolis and explain himself. And I get a call from a senior aide to the school superintendent who used to work for the county executive Dutch Ruppersberger, and I'd known for a lot of years, going back to personal relationships, who says, Bryan, what do I need to do to make this thing go away? And I said, Bob, all you need to do is give me the deputy superintendent's salary. And there was this long pause on the other end of the phone, and he said, that's it? That's it. And he asked me if I'd meet him for lunch, and he would give it to me. And so I met him at the Towson Diner, and he wrote the salary down on a napkin and slid it across the table and said, there you go. And I went back and I wrote a story about what she was making. And that was the end of it. But it took 36, 37 days of writing about it every day, calling them every day, and pushing for something that was not subject to the Public Information Act request, to get that information. So you have to be willing to sort of think a little outside the box and know the law. I think if Rebecca is still on, I think I'm gonna stop here. Actually, I'm gonna back up 1 second and mention there's one thing that we haven't talked about, and Rebecca did ask me when we jumped on to talk a little bit about the pandemic. And the pandemic has changed everything, including how we're handling Public Information Act requests. The governor's executive orders have essentially give him wide power to suspend a lot of laws. And one of those laws that is suspended is the Public Information Act. So we are finding that some agencies, my experience right now has mostly been state agencies. I have not heard a lot of complaints about local agencies, but I believe local agencies could raise the issue that they don't have to respond as quickly because of the state of emergency. I'm finding that state agencies are rejecting requests, telling you to come back later, telling you that this is going to take longer, that you're not going to see things in 30 days. Other agencies are being good. Department of Health, not great. If you're looking for documents and public records in the State Department of Health, they've been really difficult to get, and I am getting response after response basically telling me that the executive order means that that they're not subject to the 10 and 30-day timelines. Department of Labor was pretty good. I filed a request. They got me they had some things that they could give me right away. They had some things that they sort of staged out over 30 days. And they came back and asked me to work with them on an email request that I filed to help them narrow it down a little bit, which, to be honest with you, they weren't there. It wasn't really a matter of money when they told me the size of the request, and that I thought was fairly narrowly tailored. I realized that it was even too large. If they dumped all those documents on me, it was too large for me to even handle. So they were actually really pretty good to deal with. So I will just tell you, be prepared going in to see the potential for delays. I think a lot around that in terms of how we're dealing with it, and some of this in the end might end up having to go to court. But I will tell you, especially right now with the economy the way it is, if publishers were hesitant about spending the money to go to court before when times were not like this, I think it's probably going to have to be a really interesting and a really interesting case to get a publisher to hire a lawyer to go to court to sue a state agency to get something from an agency that's declining you because of the current state of emergency. So with that, I think I'll throw it over back to Rebecca and see if we've got questions.
Sure. Actually, we haven't gotten a lot of questions throughout our time together, but in the group chat, I did throw up the Maryland Attorney General's page, which has links to the PIA manual and things of that nature. I would also note that in Delaware, we have the FOIA and the Open Meetings Act are conjoined in statute. So it works.
Interesting.
And I think that's something to remember, that each state is different. You have the federal FOIA law, but then every state is different. And then I feel like every locality kind of has its own little dash of their own freestyling way of doing things.
And you raise actually a really good point, Rebecca. And I see there's a question here I'm going to get to in 1 second. One of the things that's important to remember is that there may be a lot of agencies that collect or touch the document you're looking for. So I mentioned going to the courts and looking for things in the court records, but there are a lot of times where forms that get filed, for example, in the school system, there are forms that where they have to track items that contain asbestos, and they have to file regular reports on this. And so I have run into situations where an individual, you're supposed to be able to walk into the school and be able to see these reports. And I ran into a situation where a parent was having trouble with that, but you can get them from a federal agency and it's very easy to get. And so sometimes knowing whether or not the same document collected by a local government or a state government agency also shows up in other places is really handy to know, because sometimes that state record that's also sitting in your local county Department of the Environment, somebody in the local department that might be willing to just show you the file and not without you having to file a request. So real quick, the question, any tips on how to handle going about requesting info on individual cops, disciplinary matters, complaints against them, etc.? Yeah, in Maryland, good luck right now. Maryland is one of, I think, 13 states that have the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. It is fairly expansive. There is no requirement for departments to release this information. It's considered personnel data, part of their personnel record. There is a move right now in Maryland in the legislature to weaken Leo, either to strike it down or to get rid of it altogether, or to weaken it, to make these complaints a matter of public record. I can tell you, having seen this movie before, most recently in 2016, the police unions fight this pretty vigorously, and I'm not saying it won't be done, but history has taught me that is a tough ask. And so for example, in Baltimore County, when a police officer is involved in a police involved shooting, you can't even get the first name of the officer. They will give, by contract and agreement with the FOP in Baltimore County, they will tell you Sergeant Sears, a 7-year veteran. And you have to hope that when you go look in the Wilkins precinct that there aren't 8 Sergeant Searses working there, because it will make it very difficult for you to try to figure out which officer you're talking about. It's very hard to get complaints. Sometimes there are lawsuits. I think we're seeing a lot more lawsuits now. The cops are being sued as individuals and in their professional capacity. So I always recommend going back and looking at previous lawsuits against the police department and the county, especially where the police are involved. You might see some names that pop up fairly regularly. But other than that, it's very, very difficult and perhaps impossible to get the kind of information I think you're looking for by just going to the public information officer and asking or filing a Public Information Act request.
Yeah. I also wanted to jump in here, and I'm just mindful of time. It's 10:13, so if there's other questions, put them in the chat or pipe up. But around classifying disciplinary records as personnel records, that's something that the Press Association has been really vocal on the past couple of years. We've teamed with the ACLU to try and get that law changed. I felt like we were closer than we've ever been before this past session, and I think it is getting more attention because there's been a work group about it and so forth. But it is very difficult to change privacy laws around public officials and police officers in particular. So it's something that, you know, the Press Association does a lot of lobbying on all of our issues. In fact, this past session in Maryland, we were really pushing for, I think, major reforms to the PIA. We got timed out because of the truncated session, but it's something that we're going to go back and do again next year. So if there are, you know, things that need to get changed, it's always helpful to know what causes the most stress and anxiety for our reporters.
Another thing that I see, you know, in terms of personnel records, and is you will see a lot of, especially local governments, attempt to block access to things that we would commonly refer to as directory information, wanting to know the names of people who work in a particular department and their email addresses and phone numbers. You know, Baltimore County, which is where I cut my teeth covering county government. They used to have a really great directory that they put out every year that was that listed in every department. It listed every employee with their direct extension and their email address. And I probably had 15 years worth of those directories. And kept them on my desk. I mean, because it was sometimes interesting to be able to track movement. Sometimes employees will leave departments and go to other departments. That can be helpful in reaching out to someone who, say, you know, works in the planning department but used to work in zoning, who might be willing to talk to you a little bit about about how things work in the zoning, in the zoning office. The county stopped publishing those, and I remember I had to fight for some time. They started publishing an internal document on their intranet. It was essentially the same document published electronically, and I eventually got a copy of one, but I had to fight pretty hard to get one. They kept trying to deny me on the grounds that it was considered a personnel record. Just even though I could, for example, file a request and get a list of all of the salaries of every county employee, and they would give me the names and their salaries. They were trying to tell me that the names and email addresses and phone numbers were considered personnel information. And so you'll get some of these odd ones, and they throw things at you in the hopes that you'll simply go away. And that's a good place to remind people to, when you run into these problems, we do have, and it's fairly new here in Maryland, the Public Information Act Ombudsman, who is part of the Attorney General's office. And her job is to essentially try to find ways of negotiating between the folks who are filing requests and the agencies to facilitate some of the getting these documents. It doesn't always work. Her agency doesn't have the ability to require a government agency to release these things. She tried to help me a couple of years ago, I guess about a year and a half ago, get a contract for a lawyer that was hired by the legislature's joint council on ethics. And we had done a story. We knew who the lawyer was, even though they wouldn't tell us because they said it was confidential by law. We wanted to know how much they were paying the law firm and whether or not they had bid this out. And they were denying us in some cases saying it was confidential by law, and in other places saying that there were some personnel issues attached to it. And in the end, even though the Public Information Act ombudsman came back to me and she said, Bryan, I can't find an attorney in the Attorney General's office that thinks that they've got a leg to stand on. We're not going to shake this loose unless your editor is willing to go to court on it. And it was just something that, we would have liked to have had it, but I don't think my editor at the time was ready to make a federal case on it. Hey, Rebecca, I think you're muted.
I was muted. What a party
There
foul
you go.
on my part. Sorry. So I'm just noticing we're a little bit past time. And so I wanted to just provide some closing thoughts here, that public records can be, there's a lot of nuances. There's a lot of exceptions in whatever public records law you're operating under. And so it's always good to focus on the statute and make the custodian tell you why they're denying you. If they're denying,
in writing, make them tell you in writing.
Exactly. But also, as Bryan said, don't discount the power of the sweet talk, building relationships, whether you have to do that remotely or at some point are able to do that in person, because you want to be able to get the information without having to file a public records request. So there's a lot of nuances in this. It's always changing as well. And so we're looking at, from the association level, we're looking always to strengthen and push forward in this arena. And there's a lot of committed individuals and groups out there who are very interested in public records. So sometimes those can be allies, sometimes they just drag you down, but there's a lot of people that focus on this. And I'm glad that you all were so interested and came to join us today. Bryan, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would, if you've got somebody in the office that's really good at this, I would make a friend, and ask them your questions. And I'll just say I've been doing this for a lot of years and filing requests. If you guys have questions, something general that you guys think I can answer later on, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is bsears@thedailyrecord.com. Or check in with Rebecca. Rebecca knows exactly how to find me. If I can answer a question or perhaps help in any way, I'm happy to try to do it.
Terrific. Well, I put Bryan's email address in the chat, and we will leave it at that. I thank you all for coming out today. And once this is processed and done, I'll post it on YouTube so that you can go back to it if you need to. But thanks again, Bryan, for spending your morning with us. I appreciate it. All right. Oh, and Jeremy, what a great thing to end on. Jeremy's comment is, Bryan, you kick ass. Thanks for leaving us with your smarts. So yes, cheers to that. And you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.